Pope Francis' synod is radical, but not in the way his critics think. The assembly that Pope Francis opened in Rome last week is radical, though not in the sense that his right-wing critics have in mind. Its purpose is downright revolutionary for our era. He's trying to get the Catholic churches' warring camps to listen to each other. The meeting's mysterious name, Synod on Synodality, calls to mind the old joke about the Department of Redundancy Department. Synodality is a very churchy word that spell check has problems with and that even devout Catholics rarely summon. But synodality, defined as consulting, listening and deliberating together, Francis is fond of the word encounter, is precisely the point of the meeting. It involves not only cardinals and bishops but also priests and lay people, including women, a big step for a church that privileges male power. The Synod has its roots in the Second Vatican Council of the 1960s that opened the Church to the world, commended the synodal approach and defined the Church not in terms of some ecclesiastical structure but as the people of God. These days, the Catholic people of God are fiercely divided, not unlike many other faith traditions and entire nations. This frustrates Francis, who thinks the joy of the gospel should be enough for all factions. He hopes that reasoning together might remind them of this. "I think he wants to create the conditions for the Church to have a future," said a Catholic official involved in planning the synod who preferred not to be named, "and if it's to have a future, it has to learn to get along with itself, and outsiders, too." The preparatory document for the synod spoke of an imperative to manage tensions without being crushed by them, an idea that might be appealing right now in the U.S. Congress. If it's successful, the official added of the synod, it could change the ways in which Catholics sort out their own differences, and that could be a gift to the wider culture. Such happy endings are rare in this imperfect world, and the Church is still dealing with fallout from the sex abuse scandals, large-scale defections among the young, and differing priorities in the global North and South. Francis' open-ended vision is itself a challenge to traditionalists who think the Church's doctrine is immutable and its job is to hold fast and keep proclaiming it. Many progressive Catholics, with whom I identify, hope a 3-year process that began with consultations among Catholics around the world could culminate in Vatican III and a new round of major reforms. Among them, opening the priesthood to women and married men, a change in the Church's doctrinal approach to LGBTQ+ and divorced people, and a greater emphasis on social justice and environmental concerns. But the dreams of liberals are the nightmares of Church conservatives, as Francis critics brought home with a statement on the eve of the synod in which 5 cardinals explained a series of skeptical questions they had posed to the Pope this summer. The traditionalists claimed that statements from highly placed prelates were openly contrary to the constant doctrine and discipline of the Church and could generate great confusion and the falling into error among the faithful. Popes don't always respond to such questions, known as dubia, but Francis did. He offered a classic summary of the view that there's nothing wrong with a tradition keeping itself alive by responding to new insights and circumstances. The Church, he wrote, must be humble and recognize that she never exhausts its unfathomable richness and needs to grow in her understanding. He added, every theological current has its risks, but also its opportunities. In the short term, the synod is unlikely to meet liberal hopes or justify conservative fears. But this will not reassure Francis' critics because his definition of the Church's central task differs from the prescriptions of his predecessors, Popes Benedict XVI and John Paul II. Pope Francis is attempting to move us away from the culture war mindset, said Kathy Caveney, a professor of law and theology at Boston College. John Paul and Benedict were responding to the problem of relativism. Pope Francis recognizes that the real problem is nihilism, the view that nothing and no one has value. What overcomes nihilism is not an argument but personal encounter that reveals the value of people and the communities they build together. The Pope's approach to LGBTQ+ issues fits this model. He's made a critique of theology that isn't sufficiently rooted in pastoral concerns, said the Reverend David Hollenbach, a moral theologian at Georgetown University, where I teach, meaning thinking about how people are treated. As Francis wrote in his reply to the conservative cardinals, we cannot be judges who only deny, reject, and exclude. The synod will meet until the end of the month, and there will be another session next year. A lot could happen, or people might just keep talking. In his sermon opening the Synod, Francis urged participants to be open to the surprises of the Holy Spirit. Given the stresses the Pope is trying to ease, the Holy Spirit has a lot of work to do. Pope Francis' Synod is radical, but not in the way his critics think. The assembly that Pope Francis opened in Rome last week is radical, though not in the sense that his right-wing critics have in mind. Its purpose is downright revolutionary for our era. He's trying to get the Catholic Church's warring camps to listen to each other. The meeting's mysterious name, Synod on Synodality, calls to mind the old joke about the Department of Redundancy. The GOP can't afford to indulge populism. Conservatives want to unite the country, while politicians like Trump seek only to stoke grievance. The traditionally conservative and Trumpian populist wings of the GOP have arrived at the same conclusion: they can no longer coexist in the same party. Mike Pence, a traditionalist, recently said Republican voters must choose between being the party of conservatism and following the siren song of populism unmoored to conservative principles. The future of this party, Mr. Pence said, belongs to one or the other, not both. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, a populist, said much the same last year in the Washington Post: the old Republican Party is dead, which is no reason to mourn. In Mr. Hawley's view, Republicans should embrace economic policies that would transform the party into one that represents America's working people. For Mr. Pence, the GOP must be the party of limited government, free enterprise, fiscal responsibility, and traditional values. Normally, politics is about addition, not subtraction. Voters can disagree on issues while sharing general principles. Messrs. Pence and Hawley contend that the differences in principle between conservatism and populism make them incompatible. I agree. The Republican Party is and should remain conservative, the opposite of populist. To understand this incompatibility, let's compare a key tactic of populism, appeals to us versus them division, with the original purpose of the Republican Party, the preservation of the Union. Populist politicians promote themselves as fighters. They aggressively wage culture wars and stoke grievance. They don't belong in the party of Abraham Lincoln, who tried desperately to hold the fracturing nation together. A month before the outbreak of the Civil War, he pleaded with his countrymen: "We are not enemies but friends, we must not be enemies." For Lincoln, America's hope was in its people, and the leadership's responsibility was to evoke the people's most noble instincts, the better angels of our nature. True conservatism places more emphasis on the soul of the nation than on the policies that emanate from Washington. Populist leaders like Donald Trump, who openly flouts the standards of basic human decency and appeals to rage, "I am your retribution," evoke our basest instincts. Committed to Lincoln's purpose, traditionalists